I do want to tell you a story before we start this class. If you are one of the 2 or 3 people that see my Thursday Thought video and watched my video this last Thursday, you know this story. But for many of you, you probably haven't done that, and that's okay. I'll tell you the story. We had, at one time, kind of a cohort of our outdoor friends, if you recall, several years ago, that would spend time out here under the south canopy. And one of those guys was a guy, his first name is Jim. He was one who, he still has a ponytail from, I don't know, back when. He was the one who always slept sitting up with his back to the wall, and he had a club right next door to him, so he could pick it up in case he needed to defend himself in some way or another. Well, that group sort of disbanded. A couple of them found places to live. 1 or 2 of them went to different towns for supposedly relatives were there and were going to take them in and so on. But Jim was one of the ones who didn't have any place to go. But he didn't want to stay there by himself, and so he found some other place. I don't even know where it is, but he found some other place to go. He comes by every once in a while, every so often, and he came by every so often anyway, just kind of catch us up on what's going on and how things were going with him and so on. He never asked for anything really, but he just wanted to kind of keep touch with us, and that's a good thing. A little over a year ago, Jim decided that, Jim is 65 today. I don't know if his birthday's today, but as of now, he's 65. A little over a year ago, he decided that he wanted to take advantage of his Social Security and eventually, when he turned 65, Medicare and possibly Medicaid. Up until about 10 years ago, Jim had been working. He had been working in, I think, aircraft. And he had a home, he had a job, he worked, he has Social Security credits, he has, he's eligible for Medicare, all of that. But about 10 years ago, a little bit more than that, back into 2008, 2009, 2010, the world kind of fell out from underneath him and he just never did recover. So a little over a year ago, he decided he wanted to get his ID because he didn't have that either. And he started the process of getting his identification, because without that, you can't get Social Security, you can't get Medicare, you can't open a bank account, you can't get housing, you can't do anything without an ID. Over this past year, we have been kind of going along with him in this process of getting an ID. He just got his ID this past week. He's been working for over a year to get the documentation he needed in order to apply for the identification. Now, I think I've talked to you some about this before, and many of you know about this. There is sometimes an incredibly complex bureaucratic maze that people, especially homeless people, have to go through in order to get even documentation for an identification card. But Jim was persistent. He was persistent. He kept at it. He kept at it. He kept at it. The last thing he needed was his birth certificate from Oklahoma. His birth certificate from Oklahoma took well over 6 months to get. He had correspondence with them many times. He called them. He talked with them. He emailed them. He faxed them. They called back, they emailed back, they faxed back, we need this, we need that, we don't have this, we didn't get what you sent, whatever. And I'm not having a problem particularly with Oklahoma. It's kind of that way. He needed another form of ID that, there are like, I think, 3 different categories, and you have to have one thing from each category. There was one category he didn't know where he was going to get whatever it was he needed. He finally remembered that he had been arrested and booked into jail once, years ago. And believe it or not, that booking serves as one of those things in that category. So he went to Sedgwick County Jail. Sure enough, they had his booking, they had his photo, they had all the stuff. And so he finally figured out, hey, I can use that. So he did. Anyway, Jim got his ID. Finally, this past week, he went to the DMV. He knows that if you go to the DMV and you say, I need an ID in order to vote, they are to give you that ID at no charge. I looked on the website for the state of Kansas DMV, and that is true. And it says that that service is available any time. It doesn't have to be just a few weeks before an election. It's good any time. So he says, he comes by and he says, I'm going to go to the DMV and I'm going to go get my ID. So he went over there, and about an hour later he came back and he said, I couldn't get it. He said, I told the woman I needed this ID in order to vote, and she said, that'll be $18, please. He said, I need it in order to vote. I'm supposed to get this at no charge. That'll be $18. So he came back and he said, what do I do? And I said, well, here's $18, Jim. I think I actually gave him 30 just to make sure that it was enough. So he went over, and about 30 minutes later he came back and he had the receipt, that piece of paper you get, when you do your thing. He said, I got it. And I guess I tell you that story just to tell you that's, oh, by the way, he also says, I'm done living outside. He says, I'm tired, I'm cold, I'm done living outside. He said, with this ID, he said, I can get into a housing program, I can get my Medicare, I can get my Social Security. He had no clue how to apply for Social Security. So he's been working with that. He tried to get it on his phone, and they said, well, you have to download this app. He didn't know what an app was. And I said, okay, Jim. He said, how did you get Social Security? I said, well, I did it on a computer. I didn't do it on my phone. So he's over at the library, and he was going to go on the computer at the library and see if he could go through that way without having to download an app. Now, I don't know if he ever got that or not. That was like Thursday of this past week. I really feel for Jim in terms of applying for Medicare, Part B, Part D, all of that. Maybe a supplement plan. I said, Jim, if you think applying for Social Security is difficult, I said, you need this phone number. It's a phone number of the SHIC program, the Volunteer Medicare People Program. I said, you need to talk to these people more than once, and you need to kind of get straightened out. This is a man that has been living outside for well over 10 years, and he has no clue how to do all of this. And he's finding it difficult to even find the help that he needs once he gets his ID, which he's been working on for over a year, just to get what he needs. He wants to get inside. He wants to be kind of a regular guy. His Social Security check, he's already checked on how much that supposedly was going to be. He's going to have enough money in his Social Security check that he's going to do fairly well for him. He's going to need subsidized housing, but he can make it. He can make it. Anyway, I tell you that just to let you know of one thing, one person that we've been working with for over a year, and finally we have something that came to fruition. Sometimes loving people and sometimes mission work is very slow. It's kind of a slog. You work with one or two people. You don't know. I don't know. Jim has never asked anything about religion. He's never asked anything about God. We've talked a little about that, but, and Jim may never come around to that point. But it's sometimes a long and slow and tedious work that you have to go through with that kind of thing. Anyway, I want to tell you thank you, because you make it possible for us to be at the office 9 to 4, 9 to 5, whatever it is, so that people like Jim can stop by the office and get the help that they need. How many churches, how many church offices, how many church buildings are empty during the week and there's nobody there, and there's nobody to answer the phone, and there's nobody to open the door, and there's nobody to give any help? You make it possible.
Did you ever find out why the woman requested or had to have $18 to fulfill his ID?
Yes, I emailed a friend of mine, and he is a friend of mine, Nick Hoheisel, who is my state representative. And he's also a friend of mine. And I said, Nick, what's going on? This is what happened. Told him the story. And he said, I've had another constituent or two complain about that. And I've had another constituent or two complain about antique tags. I don't know what the deal is with that. You might know more about that than I do. That they're charging maybe that they shouldn't be for, I don't know how that is for antique tags. He said, I think it's a training issue. He said, it is true that you should be able to get it for nothing. He said, I will contact DMV and I will suggest that they provide better training for their employees. That's the best that he could do. But he suspects it's a training issue. Said there's nothing wrong with the law. There's nothing wrong there. It's maybe bureaucracy, somebody that wasn't specifically told. Or maybe somebody that thought, well, I'll give it for free 3 days before the election, but we're not going to have another election for another year and a half, so they don't really need it to vote. Well, that's not what the law says. The law says it's available anytime. So, that's it.
Are you aware that Sedgwick County and City of Wichita right now are in the process of developing a one-stop facility to help with homelessness, mental health, and addiction?
I am aware.
Be located in the former Clap Golf Course area down in Perry and Oliver.
I am aware, Bob, that Commissioner Cruz is a big proponent of this. I have talked with Commissioner Cruz about it. I was not aware that it is in the process of actually being done. But I know that there was talk about it, discussion about it, that kind of thing. It would be great if we could do something like that, similar to what we do with the Child Advocacy Center, which is kind of a one-stop shop for child abuse and trafficking and so on. There are, I forget how many agencies at that center. I think there are over a dozen agencies, and over 50 people work in the Child Advocacy Center every day. Everybody from the police and sheriff's office to counselors to the district attorney to whoever. And if we could do that with that, where they could go, they wouldn't have to go over here, over here, over here, over there, and be shoved around to different places, which is the way it is now. If they could work with housing, work with identification, work with, I don't know, whatever it is they need, I'm all for that. And I'm glad to hear that they're actually doing something with that.
There is a group that has already visited Haven of Hope in San Antonio, which is a similar one-stop shop program.
Okay.
That in preparation for trying to develop one here.
I was hoping that anything that they might do would be closer to downtown, but that's okay. That's okay. At least we'll have one.
Well, I think Clap Park just maybe happens to be where they have the land available.
Right.
For something like
Right.
that.
And oh, by the way, with an ID, Jim can get bus fare at half price. I mean, there's just a world of things that open up if you have your identification. Okay, I'm sorry to get on that tangent, but I thought that story was worth telling, and I thought it was worth telling you. Thank you for what you do to make that kind of thing possible. A couple of weeks ago, we did not have class last week. A couple of weeks ago, we went more deeply into what we called the business model of the church. We looked at some things that in terms of that business model, we probably need to have, like nonprofit incorporation, liability and building insurance, bank accounts, the ability to enter into contract agreements, that kind of thing. There are some aspects of today's world where the business model is pretty much a necessity in order to make a church operate, I guess would be the way to say that. But there are some aspects of the business model of today's church that we said that we believed kind of ran afoul, we think, or at least I think anyway, of God's plan for the New Testament church. Although we can find some aspects of a business model in the New Testament, the appointment of deacons, for example, to oversee the distribution of benevolence in the book of Acts, I think Acts chapter 7 or 8, if I'm not mistaken. What we talked about regarding other aspects of the business model kind of seemed to be missing, or at least in very different configuration to what we see in the New Testament. Those parts of the modern business model which seem to run most afoul of New Testament example is the idea, seems to me, of church leaders and staff. We talked about this, church leaders and staff being providers or even entertainers, and the members being consumers or those who are entertained. In this part of the business model, the church leadership is constantly working to find something new and different every Sunday in order to continually create some kind of an experience of some kind for the consumer. That would be those who came and sat in the pews, so that the consumer will continue to consume what the leadership provides rather than go on to the next church down the road, which might have a better entertainment experience than what we can provide. Well, this kind of a mindset, if you have this kind of a mindset, that kind of brings about a what's in it for me if you're a church member, and an I need to be fed or I need to be entertained attitude, mentality, whatever, on the part of the member, rather than one of humility, service, worship, relationship. Seems to me that those might be more what God has in mind for the church family than being entertained or consuming something. And a brother-sister sibling bond that we've also talked about in the church family, we've seen that in the New Testament. That kind of goes down in priority several steps when you have the business model of the church with the entertainment factor that's put into that. We also talked about an over-reliance on preaching and classes to provide all or by far most of a Christian spiritual food. And I said all or by far most of the Christian spiritual food. We brought up the idea of the spiritual disciplines and how these need to have some kind of a root in the heart of the Christian in order for real spiritual growth to occur. I'm sorry, just sermons and just classes are not going to result in a lot of spiritual growth. They're helpful, but if that's all you do for 45 minutes a week, probably isn't going to be enough. And we also talked about an over-reliance on marketing. Advertising, signs, commercials, the internet, other ways to market in order to bring new people inside the building on Sunday morning. Now, we realize that the apostles and the evangelists in the New Testament did a kind of a marketing, various ways. I think including the working of miracles. I think that was really kind of a form of marketing back in that day. And it isn't wrong to have a sign on the building. It's not wrong to have a web page on the internet. It's not wrong to do those things. But the question would be what kind of reliance you're placing on those tools to influence people. And once you do influence people, what is the message that you're telling? You remember I talked about Sight and Sound Theater a couple of weeks ago, and about the marketing that they do and the experience that they say they offer. I have no issue with that. Sight and Sound, we've been there 2 or 3 times, and it's just, it really is an experience. Today, the idea of marketing the church experience is based on offering events, offering programs that appeal to customers being the members or the visitors. Seems that churches of today, when they're in this kind of a mode, believe themselves to be woefully lacking unless they have a singles program, a youth ministry, life group ministry, service projects, other events, other programs. Again, nothing wrong with those, but what's really important? What's really important? And we understand that when we look at the New Testament church, we're looking at a different time. We're looking at a different society. We're looking at a different culture. Not all we see in the New Testament church could or should be an example for us to follow exactly. But can we harvest some principles from what we find in Scripture? Can we find some principles there? Well, going back to the Acts chapter 2 church, which most of you are very familiar with, we see that it was fellowship, worship, and prayer, preaching, study of the Word, the Old Testament, that initially caused the church to grow. That's what it says. We also see meeting from house to house, eating common meals together, sharing resources with each other. We see all of that in Acts chapter 2. One thing we see in this passage that we often overlook is how they did these things. Verse 46 says that they did these things with, and I quote, with great joy and generosity, all the while praising God. With great joy and generosity, all the while praising God, they did these things. What does that tell you? That betrays an attitude. There's an attitude there. Attitude's just as important, if not more so, than just the action. So maybe it's time we inserted a little more joy, generosity, and praise to God in the things that we do for and with our church family. I wonder how that might change things. And again, when I talk about the church of today, I'm not talking specifically about Riverwalk. I'm talking about the church in general today. But if the shoe fits, what we don't see in Acts chapter 2 is young families ministry, a seniors ministry, or some other program. We do see the development of a kind of a benevolent program where people willingly shared with others in need. Later on in Acts, we see the apostles appointing those special servants to see to the needs of those in the church. But other than that, I don't see much else in the way of events or programs, at least in the early days of the church. I'm not saying that youth ministry is a sin or that partnering with Franklin Elementary is unscriptural somehow or another. But what it does say is that if we over-rely on these things for our growth, marketing, paid staff, programs, and so on, we're probably heading off in a direction maybe that God had not intended. Comments yet? Julie.
I think this fits what you're saying. Many of the women in this room yesterday had the experience of having an Acts 2 moment. We had fellowship, we had a service project, we had prayer, we had wonderful interactions with one another. I don't know how much that will help us grow, but it helped me grow. And those kinds of things, I think, are the attitudes that we're talking about.
Yep, I agree. And I wish I could have been a fly on the wall yesterday.
We would have spotted you. Sorry, I don't like flies.
I'm not often at a loss for words, but
Women's role was not on the subject.
first thing I thought of would be be a pretty big fly, you know. But I wish that somehow or another I could have, not only as an elder, but as a husband and just someone who's part of this group of Christians that meet here, just to see what was, I know what the intent was of the women that were planning this, you know, and I was kind of in on some of the, you know, and so on with Casey and whoever coming in and talking with Linda and getting things going and so on. So I had kind of an idea, but I really kind of wished I could have been there. And it kind of makes me wonder whether maybe, Mike, Steve, maybe you guys need to plan something for the men, you know, kind of along the same lines. Really, you know, that might not be a bad thing to do. I doubt that we will.
No crafts, please.
Right. I doubt that we'll do some of the stuff that you do, you know. We might set up a shooting range or, you know, something like that, but no, I agree. It's the attitude with which you go into something like that and the intent that you have. If you know that the intent is to foster relationships, fellowship, prayer, and so on, you willingly and I'll say generously participate in those things rather than kind of standing back and, I really don't like the crafts, so I'm not going to, you know, that kind of thing. I agree.
Jay.
Yes, ma'am.
So Caleb is off at school, and part of me was very worried, I guess, when he left as to where he would find friends, what avenue he would take, and my heart is so happy when I talk to him because he has connected with the Cats for Christ in Manhattan, and literally, I think Mondays and Tuesdays are his only days that he's with friends that are not a part of that. And he goes to church. He tells me, like, last weekend he was in Salt Lake City for an agronomy thing, and he told me before he left, he said, Mom, they announced that we were going to have snack time at church on Sunday, which is actually their fellowship meal. It can be confusing because of the name, but he said, I was super excited that it was snack time, but then I was super bummed because I wasn't going to be there. And he's connected with the little old ladies at church that insert themselves at the table and share meals with them.
Yeah.
The men provided a meal they catered it in. Don't worry, they didn't cook. To celebrate the women of the church and all they do. And he said, Mom, this is what the church should be. Like, where they're always together and finding ways to be together.
Right.
And he's at Bible studies Friday and Wednesday, Thursdays and Fridays. Like, he's there, and seeing him and hearing him say, Mom, this is really what I think the church should be, like, always involved in the desire to lift each other up. And so that's just really cool to hear him say.
Yeah.
And I know, he knows
Yeah.
this church is his family, and he's had a very good foundation. But to see him on his own and seeing him say,
Yeah, and telling you that.
and telling me, yeah, I don't, I thought he went to Bible study one night a week, and then he's like, oh no, I got Bible study at mine, and I got Bible study this day, and I'm like, oh, wow, I got a lot of Bible study. I'm good with that. But he's seeking it because those relationships are there.
You know, and I think many of us, several of us who may have had kids that go off to school, I mean, we've got kind of a similar, when Michael went to Emporia, he got connected with the Emporia Student Center that the church there operated, and he got to know a lot of the people in the church there, and the elders and the women, and one family especially that he still, for those of you that know Barry Weekly, who comes to services, he and Barry are lifelong friends now because of their meeting at Emporia. And he's still friends with the guy who was operating the student center and so on. And he was, they elected him president of the student center in his senior year. And it was just good to know. Now, we got a little nervous from time to time because he also told us, he said, some of the guys and I will go out on Friday night or Saturday night. He said, I'm the designated driver. And so, they went to the bar someplace. He had a Coke or whatever, and he was the designated driver to make sure that the rest of the guys got, well, that made me a little nervous, but at the same time, he's doing something that I thought was good. So, you just, and I think I think that in part came about because of his relationship with the people at the student center. Curtis?
I think both Julie and Casey have a key insight there, especially for us here, because, Julie was saying, I don't know if this will help us grow in the body in general in terms of, but it helped me grow. And I think that's actually very important, because the more we grow, the more we influence those who are in our circles. As the Church of Christ, we cannot compete with the entertainment model. We simply are not equipped, to do the way that we do worship and stuff. It's just not going to compete with the mega church sort of thing. And we don't even have a leg in the door in that regard.
Right.
And at our current size of church, we can't offer a huge young adults ministry and all these kind of things. And so, but what can we do? We can have really deep relationships with each other, where we can live with one another, we can grow in the faith together, and then we can feel comfortable to invite people who are in our circles of influence, whether it be at work or family or whatever, into that, because it's a joyous community, and people, so that, we're not, my perception is this church is going to always have trouble doing the mass appeal, because we can't compete with all that's out there. But what we can do is this relational discipleship sort of model, where we're in each other's lives and finding joy in each other, and we can invite people into that, and that has its own attraction. It may be slower, it may not have that mass appeal, but it's more, I think, authentic, more whole,
Right.
Better, more healthy.
And going back to the college thing, I know Michael brought people to the student center. I know he brought his friends, some of which he ferried around as the designated driver to the student center. And I know, based on just what you said, Caleb may well be or going to be doing the same thing with friends that are not currently a part of that, because it's such a good experience for him, and it was for Michael as well, that, hey, come on over here. We've got, of course they had meals and whatever there too, and I think that was probably the big attraction for some of them, but that's okay. It works. It works. As Curtis said, it's slow, but it works.
I think what we're finding is people are losing interest in the mass appeal anyway. And I think that's the entire point of what's going on in not only Churches of Christ, but everywhere. And that's why people didn't come back from the pandemic. I think they find the current model void of depth. And so why come back? And so I think when we try to appeal to the mass, we're going to water down our message. And it goes back to that John 13 verse. People will know us by our love. Not the programs we offer, not the volunteer opportunities we have, but the fact that we love each other, and they're going to be drawn to that. I have 3 girls in their 20s. They are done with programs. They want to see you back up what you say with love.
Yeah.
That is what they are longing for. They're longing for smaller, they're longing for deeper, they're longing for a depth that these math programs can't offer. Math programs, I think, offer volunteers, but they don't make disciples. And our children are wanting, they are longing to be discipled.
And that depth that you're talking about is not a 150 at a time, it's a one at a time, and sometimes that one at a time takes a year, 2 years, 5 years, or whatever. You know, we haven't gotten very far spiritually with Jim, the guy I was talking about earlier. But, you know, we've only known him 4 or 5 years now, you know.
And let me back up by saying my girls went to religious schools. They went to Christian elementary, they went to Christian high school, and they went to Christian colleges. So this isn't just, you know, they are coming from, they were in the door every time it was open. They did every youth activity. We were staple in the youth program, and they are still, that did not fill them up. They are still longing for that deeper relationship.
Amy, you may have to put off your January start of your class. I've only done a page and a half, and that's okay. That's okay. Classes are of necessity going to maybe not necessarily adhere to a strict monthly schedule. We'll see how that goes, too. Well, we got a little bit of time left, what kind of specific things might we see from a church that over-relies on paid staff, marketing, and programs? What might that look like? If you would look at a church and you say, I wonder if they're over-relying on paid staff. I wonder if they're over-relying on marketing or programs. What might you see there? Paid staff. Let's go there first. And you can plug your ears, Curtis, if you want to. It's fine with me.
I'm gonna go ring the bell right now.
It's a second bill.
Over-reliance on paid staff, and I stress that, over-reliance on paid staff, would tend to bring about congregations where a few people do most of the work. It's difficult to find class teachers. It's difficult to find mentors. It's difficult to find encouragers. It's difficult to find helpers. It's difficult to find others to minister to their fellow family members. That same over-reliance would in many cases tend to cause burnout among paid staff, and thankfully I don't see that in any of the paid staff here, because they're expected to be all things to all people. You might see depression, you might see anxiety, more common among paid staffers. Those are some of the things, it's not an all-encompassing list, but those are some of the things that you might see if there's an over-reliance on paid staff to provide the experience for the members or the consumers. Sermons and classes. Over-reliance on sermons and classes to provide all of the instruction for a person or a family might manifest in biblical illiteracy. If all the Bible a person is exposed to is 20 or so minutes once a week, listening to a one-size-fits-all sermon, and you alluded to that, the sermons have to be watered down to meet the needs of the masses, it would be virtually impossible to get the kind of genuine growth into spiritual maturity that you need. Okay, I'm going to call you to task here. Let's go off on a tangent, another one. Bible knowledge is not the only marker of spiritual maturity, but it is a place to begin. How many of us can write down 8 of the 10 commandments? Or 7 of the 10 commandments?
Not bad.
Not necessarily word for word, but just tell me what the commandments, talk about. How many of us can list half of the Beatitudes? I have to confess, I don't even know how many Beatitudes there are. How many have memorized various parts of the Bible? And Jesus wept is not the only verse that... How many of us can answer questions that might be posed to us by an atheist? How many of us don't really know how to study and learn from the Bible? How many of us know what's needed in our lives to be holy, becoming more like Jesus? 2015, the Barna Group, some of you know what that is, the Barna Group, Barna Research Group, commissioned a study trying to determine how many people who claimed to be Christians really held to a Christian worldview. For the study, they included 6 of what they considered to be basic tenets of the Christian faith. Now, when I read these 6, you may agree or disagree with these basic tenets, but nevertheless, these are what Barna asked about with this random group of Christians, people who called themselves Christians. Here are the 6 things. Absolute moral truth exists. The Bible is totally accurate in all the principles it teaches. Satan is a real being or force, not merely a symbol. A person cannot earn their way into heaven by being good or doing good works. Jesus Christ lived a sinless life on earth. And God is the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the world who still rules the universe today. Those 6 things. They ask these Christians those questions as to whether they really believe those. Only 19% of those who claimed to be Christians and who answered the poll believed in or agreed with all 6 of those. 19%. Biblical illiteracy is one of the signs of a church that relies on a business-like culture for its existence. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Good Bible knowledge is no assurance that someone's a true disciple, a Christ follower in the sense of what we've been talking about here, but it can be and it is one measure of the maturity of a Christian. Oh, by the way, here's how those statements break down in terms of the numbers of adults who agree with them. 1/3 of all adults believe that absolute moral truth exists and is unaffected by the circumstances. Less than half even believe in absolute moral truth. These are people who call themselves Christians. Half of all adults believe that the Bible is accurate in all the principles that it teaches. 4/5 of those who say they were born again Christians believe that. 1/4 of adults are convinced that Satan is real. Even born again Christians, those who say they're born again, only 40% of those believe Satan is real. Only 1/4, 28%, of adults believe that it's impossible for someone to earn their way to heaven through good behavior. 47% reject the notion of earning salvation through their deeds. So over half believe that you can go to heaven by doing good things. A minority of adults, 40%, are persuaded that Jesus Christ lived a sinless life. 7 out of 10, 70%, say that God is the all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe. Those numbers kind of make me nervous. Those numbers kind of make me nervous. Yeah. 27% are convinced that Satan is real.
Jay, That same, the Barna Group did another, and I think it was in 2013, they asked non-Christians to describe Christians. And the description they got were, they're judgmental, they're anti, and there's a list, and they're boring. Okay, who would be interested in joining a group that's considered to be hateful, anti-everything, not pro-anything, and just dull to be around, joyless to be around?
I don't know a boring person in this class. Terry.
That same Barna Group in the Christian Chronicle, and I've tried to find this article, I think it was in 2006, and amongst other questions, this is relative to Satan, is Satan real? Is he a real entity? Does he actually exist? And they called out, I think there were 7 or 8 different say denominations. The Churches of Christ was one of them. It seems like, and it was just an eye-opener to me, but it seemed like something 60% of the Churches of Christ, and I don't know whether churches were located, nothing about that, but 60% of the people, the members of the Churches of Christ, believe that Satan was a real entity. That left a horrible gap of, I saw it with my own eyes. So I tried to find out. I am familiar with Barna. I've researched some things on their websites, but there are some studies that are still similar to that. And these were mainline denominations.
And these people were not necessarily Churches of Christ people. These were just people in general who called themselves Christians. These were not.
And these were called out denominations like Baptist and et cetera. And there was one group that was, I think there were 71 or 78%. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but that was the highest.
Yeah. We've got to go. The second bell has rung. We'll continue this. This has been interesting. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your interest.